Hi guys, this is Miss Howington here at Research Triangle High School. Today I am teeny weeny. So today we are going to talk about water laws and rules, as you can see right there. So, first of all, let's do a little bit of a review on why we need laws about water. So we have two main types of pollution: point source and non-point source. Point source is any single identifiable source of pollution from which pollutants are discharged, such as a pipe, a ditch, a ship, or a factory smokestack. And that is the definition according to the US EPA. So these include things like sewage treatment plants, factories, whatever, anything that directly discharges effluent into a waterway. These are pretty straightforward to identify and regulate, and so they're not really a huge problem for water quality anymore because of the Clean Water Act. Yay! And then we have non-point sources of pollution, non-point source pollution. And this is basically any pollution that comes from lots of different varied unidentifiable sources, typically in the form of runoff. This is the most common source of surface water pollution. And it's really hard to regulate because you can't tell exactly where it's coming from or who is responsible for it. And so these are things like mine drainage, agricultural runoff from animal feedlots and from croplands, stuff that might wash off of the streets, like oil and trash, extra fertilizer that might wash off of lawns and homes, extra sediment that might come from crops or construction sites, all that kind of stuff. And then, so those are the two main types of water pollution. But then we also have some other types of pollution, like air pollution can become water pollution when it combines with water in the atmosphere, like mercury and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And then it can become precipitation like acid rain, or you can get methyl mercury precipitation into water, and then it works its way up the food chain or causes other sorts of environmental problems. And then we can also, a change in hydrology can also be considered water pollution. So if any water diversions exist, so there's less water in a body of water, and that can lead to more concentrated pollution levels in bodies of water. All right, so a little bit of history. So the first time, really, maybe, that the U.S. government tried to regulate water quality was in 1965 in the Water Quality Act. It was eventually replaced by the Clean Water Act. And so this relied completely on states to improve the water quality. So states had to designate a use for each body of water, like swimming or fishing or drinking water, and then determine whatever water quality standards they thought would meet the needs of that use. However, the states didn't have a lot of political willpower or follow through to implement the standards that they set, and they didn't have the science or the technology that they needed to implement and monitor these water quality standards that they set. So it didn't work well, and then by 1970, half of the states had not even set any standards. Or if they had set standards, they didn't try to implement them. Less than 10% of municipal sewage treatment plants did nothing other than just filtering out the solids. So there was no removing of nitrogen or phosphorus. There was no disinfection, and then they just put it straight back in the waterway that it was going to go back into anyway. Less than 33% of industrial facilities, so like factories and power plants, treated their waste before they emptied their wastewater directly into a body of water. And then most notably, probably the biggest thing that kind of like stuck in the minds of the American people was in 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught on fire because it was so polluted. And also in 1970, the Clean Air Act was enacted, and that was one of the first major environmental laws. And so coming off of the success of that, the Congress decided to go with the Clean Water Act. It's a lot different from the Clean Air Act. So in 1972, it was passed. Here's a picture of Nixon signing it. The Clean Water Act applies only to navigable waterways. However, through lots of court cases, the courts have determined that that's not really what they meant when they made the law. So it applies to wetlands, to man-made canals, to dry riverbeds, and lots of other bodies of water that you couldn't necessarily take a boat up. But it does not apply to groundwater in most cases unless the groundwater is like directly feeding a surface water. So as the law was written, it was extremely ambitious. So they said the goal of the law was to provide for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wild fish, and for the recreation in and on the waters. And the goal that they stated, that Congress stated, was that by 1985 they were going to eliminate all discharges of pollutants into the nation's waterways. And clearly that was not met. Because we still have discharges of pollutants into our waterways now. So there's still a really long way to go with the Clean Water Act and cleaning up our bodies of water. So in 1996, the EPA did a survey, and from the data that they could collect, about 22% of the watersheds in the U.S. had good water quality, 50% of them had moderate water quality, and the other over 25%, or so I guess that would be what, 28%, were impaired or bad water quality. And in 2004, some states did some surveys of the bodies of water within their boundaries and found that 44% of rivers, 64% of lakes, and 30% of estuaries were impaired. And impaired just means that they are not clean enough to support their designated use. All right, so the Clean Air Act has three main provisions. So the first one is the regulation of point source pollution. And this is very, very effective. So a limit is determined by the EPA on like how much each individual point source pollution can emit or can discharge into a waterway, and that's based on whatever the current technology can do. And then anybody who is going to discharge anything into a waterway in the U.S. has to have a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. And so any discharge of any pollutant is illegal without one of these NPDES permits. And then the people who are emitting point source water pollution have to regularly self-report, and all of these reports and all of the permits are public record. So if anybody wants to go look it up, if anybody thinks something fishy is going on, they can look it up and hold the companies accountable. So this is pretty easy and solid regulation, and with very easily enforced limits. So it's pretty effective. Point source pollution is no longer one of the leading sources of pollution in any of our waterways in the U.S. So the second piece of the Clean Water Act is non-point source regulation. This is not so great. So it's pretty much the limits are left up to individual states. There's not a lot of ability for the EPA to enforce it. When there's not a lot of ability to enforce, it's not going to be very effective. So that's why non-point source is one of the biggest sources of surface water pollution. And then the third part of the Clean Water Act is the states have to set water quality standards. So each state has to designate a use for each body of water in the state, and then they have to determine what levels of water quality need to be in place to make sure that that body of water is clean enough for its designated use. So if it's for fishing, we want to make sure that there's no pollutants that fish are absorbing, that then we're going to eat, and then that's going to build up in our bodies. If it's like swimming, we want to make sure it's safe for little kids to go swimming there, that they're not going to like suck up some water and get really sick. And so the states then have to identify water quality limited waterways or impaired waterways, and then establish limits of pollutants that can be emitted into these waters from both point source and non-point source pollution. And so they set a total maximum daily load for every pollutant. So for all nitrogens, they'll set a total maximum daily load that can be discharged into the waterway and still meet the water quality limits. And then the states also have to come up with control methods to use to meet the TMDLs. And usually this is like a range of things that we would implement, or that we would impose upon industries like agriculture and forestry and construction and mining. And those have kind of mixed results with success. So that's the Clean Water Act. And then in 1974, Congress passed the Safe Water Drinking Act, that its purpose is to ensure the quality of all Americans' drinking water. And so basically with this, the EPA sets standards for drinking water quality and then oversees any entity that implements those standards. So it could be states and cities, it could be private water utilities. And then another important piece of legislation concerning like drinking water is the groundwater rule, which was created in 2006. And so the purpose of this is to reduce disease that is associated with harmful microorganisms. And so it kind of helps look at sources of fecal contamination in particular. All right, so that was a whirlwind overview of the major U.S. water laws. So hopefully that will be helpful in implementing that stuff in your project. Okay.